My wife recently was away on a trip, and part of that trip was a train journey from Pittsburgh to Washington, D.C. Now, that's an enjoyable train ride to take. It goes through some beautiful countryside. There's an observation car on the train that goes through places like Harper's Ferry. It follows the Potomac River, the C&O Canal. Very emblematic Maryland landscape. But it takes like 1 million hours, right? It leaves once a day at 5 o'clock in the morning, and it arrives at D.C. Union Station, get this, at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. So it takes as long to travel from Pittsburgh to D.C. as it does by train from Pittsburgh to New York, which in itself is an insane length of time. And when I think about things like that, one of the first things, thoughts, things, emotions that comes to mind is bafflement. How did America move from a country where the railroad crossing the continent was a profoundly courageous and important act, one that was celebrated, right? We all see those pictures in our high school history class of the last spike being banged in as the two tracks meet coast to coast. What a remarkable engineering feat. We even celebrated the rail barons, the robber barons, the foundation of capitalism. Our chosen method of extracting value is based on the railroad. And yet now, in our current culture and community, the train system, passenger train, is held up as a European socialist, probably effeminate, fill in the blank for the typical tropes and criticisms against anything that is based on community shared resources or the idea of democratically engaged populace. I mean, a fully functioning public transit system that allows for easy travel between major centers of work, activity, leisure, with then a network of local buses, trolleys, trams that allows for city dwellers to move around the city without a car, people to get in and out from the suburbs without a car. The idea that this should be something that is in the national interest and therefore sponsored by the government, dare I say paid for by the government, managed by the government, because the bottom line of those infrastructure investments should be the free movement of citizens for their life, whether that's work, leisure, relationships, family commitments. All of those are dependent on a well-run traffic infrastructure. And the fact that we don't have one in this country, it tells me that the intended consequence is to break down those structures. I mean, I remember Margaret fucking Thatcher. This was in England, of course, not the United States, but Margaret Thatcher, on her rise to the premiership in Downing Street, made statements like, if you are over 30 and riding on a bus, you are a loser. And then, in a different speech, there is no such thing as society. And this is a deliberate act of capital to break down the structures. They demand that we live in these disparate and isolated regions so that we can follow work, but then the notion that we should maintain connections and ease of use of these facilities is now considered beyond the pale. Right? Try being a politician in America speaking about investment in passenger rail travel. Right, even with it's now 10 years ago. Can you believe that? 10 years ago that Barack Obama became president with an infrastructure plan that was in part an investment to get people working and to mitigate some of the downward spiral of the financial crash where capital was not being invested in infrastructure or in the manufacture of new goods and services. It was being hoarded, still is, and turned into derivatives of enormously valuable cash assets. So we need to talk about passenger rail service in the United States as almost as a revolutionary act, I think, as a way to get people to think differently about the way that we manage government. We need to return to the idea, the progressive idea, that if something is truly necessary for the infrastructure of the nation, it should be owned, managed, sponsored, paid for by our taxes. That's what taxation is. It's a commitment to the general good. And there is no better general good than public transport. So I'm going to get off my soapbox there a little bit. I have a real love for trains. I dream about trains. I don't remember my dreams often, but when I do remember my dreams, within that subset of dreams, trains are frequently part of that, of the mix. Small, funny, odd trains, quirkily built trains that move through the landscape of my childhood, for example. I've done some of my best writing on trains. I have train rides that I have written about and that I think about often. Of course, from Pittsburgh to Philadelphia is a train ride that I've been taking more frequently in the recent years, and it's a wonderful train ride. It should only take 2 hours instead of the whatever it is, 7 or 8 hours that it does take. But I write well on trains. My gloss on Heidegger, the essay Heidegger on the Rails, I wrote in final draft on a ride from Pittsburgh up to New York last year. And you can probably hear in the background, that's my cat Theo on his scratch post. I'm going to leave that in there if you could hear it. A little bit of ambience. There's something solitary and yet connected about the pace of the train. I find it very, I find it very enjoyable simply to be on a train. There are a bunch of books and poems about trains. One of my favorite, a book called Parallel Lines by Ian Marchant. I'm going to save that for a separate chapter, because it was a very influential book for me as a writer and as a dreamer and poet and thinker. But he writes about the history of the train line in the United Kingdom and this duality between the reality of the trains that are often not well run or can be late or uncomfortable, and then the romance of the trains. But I have in front of me here a book by John Betjeman, the poet laureate in the 60s and 70s. And this book is a collection of letters and articles that were written to him or that he wrote about trains. So John Betjeman, as well as being quite a wonderful poet, perhaps a little out of fashion now, I'm not sure. I'd have to check the internet to see whether Betjeman is considered fashionable or not. But as well as being a poet, he was an architectural enthusiast to the point where the restoration and maintenance of Victorian architecture was a passion of his. He used his platform on the BBC to highlight old churches. I think he single-handedly is responsible for the eventual restoration of St. Pancras in London. But this book, On Trains, is a real gem if you can find it. Most of the letters written to Betjeman are from local enthusiasts or people who have a vested interest in a particular branch line. Betjeman himself traveled on branch lines and made documentaries about them. One of my favorite is a 10-minute film that he takes through the branch lines of East Anglia, Kingsland to Hunstanton. And they're very evocative, very wonderful. I thought what I would do to wrap this up is read a poem that Betjeman wrote, and it is set on a train. And I'm not going to brief it much. I'm just going to read it just to wrap things up. Think of it as an experience rather than a pedagogical exercise. The poem is called Pershore Station, and it is a poem by, as I said, John Betjeman. I'll put a link to it. But here goes. So, sit back, pour yourself a glass of something, and enjoy this. The train at Pershore Station was waiting that Sunday night. Gaslight on the platform. In my carriage, electric light. Gaslight on frosty evergreens. Electric on Empire Wood. The Victorian world and the present in a moment's neighborhood. There was no one about but a conscript who was saying goodbye to his love on the windy, weedy platform with the sprinkled stars above, when, sudden, the waiting stillness shook with the ancient spells of an older world than all our worlds in the sound of the Pershore bells. They were ringing them down for evensong in the lighted abbey near, sounds which had poured through apple boughs for 7 centuries here. With guilt, remorse, eternity, the void within me fills, and I thought of her left behind me in the Herefordshire hills. I remembered her defenselessness as I made my heart a stone, till she wove her self-protection round and left me on my own. And plunged in a deep self-pity, I dreamed of another wife and lusted for freckled faces and lived a separate life. One word would have made me love her. Oh, got that wrong. Totally backwards. One word would have made her love me. One word would have made her turn. But the word I never murmured, and now I am left to burn. Evesham, Oxford, and London. The carriage is new and smart. I am cushioned and soft and heated with the dead weight in my heart.